long before his name became a whisper across continents, before the battles and the marble statues and the legends that filled libraries, there was a boy who looked out over the hills of northern Greece and dreamed. His name was Alexander, son of Philip and Olympias, prince of a small kingdom called Macedon. It was not yet the center of the world, just a quiet land of mountains and vineyards, of pale stone cities and winds that carried the scent of pine and sea. The palace at Pella, where Alexander was born, was a place of both noise and stillness. Soldiers and diplomats came and went, their boots clattering in the courtyards, their voices echoing through halls lined with tapestries. But beyond the marble and the politics, the boy's world was simpler. There were gardens to wander in, horses to train with, tutors to question, and the endless curiosity of a mind that refused to rest. His father, King Philip II, was a man of order and ambition, broad-shouldered, quick-minded, a soldier who had turned Macedon from a rough, forgotten land into a rising power. He was both feared and admired, and his presence filled every room he entered. From him, Alexander inherited discipline, the sense that the world could be shaped if one only had the will to move it. His mother, Olympias, was different. She was passionate, spiritual, sometimes distant, sometimes fiercely close. She filled his imagination with stories of heroes and gods, Achilles, Heracles, Zeus. She told him he was descended from them, that divine fire ran in his blood. To a boy who already felt restless in the smallness of his world, those words became both comfort and calling. As a child, Alexander was not content to play the prince. He questioned everything. When his tutors read him the tales of Homer, he did not only listen, he argued. He wanted to know why heroes acted as they did, why the gods seemed to favor some men and abandon others. He memorized entire passages of the Iliad, not as entertainment, but as instruction. Achilles became his ideal, not just a warrior, but a man seeking glory that would outlast death. When he was 13, his father brought a philosopher from Athens to teach him, a man named Aristotle. The philosopher arrived in Macedon with scrolls, instruments, and the calm, curious air of one who had measured the stars. Under his guidance, the boy's restless energy found focus. In a quiet grove outside the city, under trees that whispered softly in the wind, lessons were given. They spoke of logic, of ethics, of medicine, of the movement of planets. They studied plants and animals, the flow of rivers, the nature of the soul. Aristotle taught Alexander that everything in the world had a purpose, that understanding was not found in conquest, but in observation. Yet, in the young prince, philosophy and fire grew together. He listened to reason, but he also dreamed beyond it. When Aristotle spoke of the limits of the known world, the pillars of Heracles to the west, the great lands of Persia to the east, Alexander asked what lay beyond them. "Perhaps nothing," Aristotle said. "Perhaps the edge of the world itself," Alexander smiled. "Then I will see for myself." He was not boastful when he said it. He spoke with the quiet confidence of one stating a fact, as though the horizon itself had already agreed to move for him. He trained every morning with the soldiers, learning to ride, to wield a spear, to lead. Philip's army was his classroom as much as Aristotle's grove. The Macedonian phalanx, that wall of men and shields and pikes, fascinated him. He studied its rhythm, its balance, its unity. Even as a boy, he saw battle not as chaos, but as music, where every movement had a place and every mistake had an echo. When he was still a child, his father received a gift, a wild horse, tall and fierce, unbroken, untamable. The grooms could not control it. It reared and kicked and refused every rider. Philip ordered it sent away. But Alexander, standing nearby, watched the animal carefully. He noticed how it shied from its own shadow, not from men, but from the darkness moving beneath it. He asked his father to let him try. The court laughed, but Philip nodded. The boy approached slowly, speaking softly, turning the horse toward the sun so that its shadow fell behind it. He climbed into the saddle, and the horse stilled. Together they galloped across the plain, the dust rising behind them, the wind in his hair. When they returned, Philip smiled. "My son," he said, "seek a kingdom equal to yourself. Macedon is too small for you." The horse was named Bucephalus, and he would carry Alexander for most of his life, across deserts, rivers, and mountains, until both horse and rider were legends bound together. Through his youth, Alexander watched his father's campaigns with fascination. Philip's wars were not of chaos, but of method. One by one, the Greek city-states fell under Macedon's influence, some by battle, others by diplomacy. The world that had once laughed at Macedon now feared it. Yet within the palace, father and son began to grow apart. Philip was practical, worldly. He saw power as a structure, something built stone by stone. Alexander, shaped by Aristotle and by myth, saw power as destiny, a flame that could leap from one world to another. Their disagreements were quiet but deep. Philip admired his son's mind, but sometimes feared his imagination. "Dream less," he told him once. "Rule more," but Alexander could not stop dreaming. He grew into manhood during an age of tension, between Greece and Persia, between his father's rising ambition and the ancient powers that lay beyond. The Mediterranean world was changing, though no one yet knew how deeply. When Philip was away, Alexander served as regent, governing the kingdom with a composure beyond his years. He led soldiers in battle for the first time, commanding men twice his age, and they obeyed him. Not because he demanded it, but because they felt, in his presence, a strange calm, the kind that comes from someone who already seems to know what must happen. And then, one summer evening, everything changed. Philip was preparing for a great campaign, an invasion of Persia, the richest empire in the world. His court was gathered for a celebration. The city was filled with music, banners, the sound of drums. But in the midst of the ceremony, a man stepped forward from the crowd, one of Philip's own guards, and struck him down. The king fell where he stood. The laughter and music turned to screams. Alexander was 20 years old. By dawn, he was king. He stood before the army, his father's army, and spoke with quiet authority. "My father is gone," he said, "but his dream remains. I will lead you where he could not." The soldiers raised their spears, the sound rolling like thunder through the valley. And somewhere in the crowd, perhaps even among the whispering winds of the hills, the gods, if they existed, turned their eyes toward the young king of Macedon, whose name would soon be spoken in every corner of the known world. The morning after his father's death was still and colorless. A thin mist hung over the palace at Pella, softening the outlines of the courtyard where guards stood watch. The torches burned low, their smoke curling upward like slow-moving threads. Inside, the new king sat alone, the air heavy with the scent of oil lamps and marble dust. Alexander had not slept. The weight of the crown, newly placed upon his head, felt neither heavy nor light, only inevitable. Outside, the city murmured. Rumors ran through the streets like wind through grass. Some said Philip had been murdered by conspirators. Others whispered that the young prince himself had known of it. In every hall, in every camp, there were questions. Questions about loyalty, about succession, about whether this boy, barely 20, could hold the kingdom his father had built. But Alexander did not speak of doubt. He called the council together at dawn. When he entered the room, No guards announced him, no music played. He simply appeared in the doorway, wearing the same plain cloak he had worn the day before. The generals turned toward him, Antipater, Parmenion, Perdiccas, men who had fought under his father for decades. "My father's body lies in Pella," he said quietly. "But Macedon still stands. The same sun rises, the same people look to us for strength. We will mourn him, and then we will continue his work." There was no tremor in his voice. No boast. Only calm. It was that calm that persuaded them. They saw in his composure not arrogance, but purpose, the still surface of a deep current that would not be turned aside. Still, not all were convinced. The death of Philip had left the kingdom fragile. In the north, the tribes of Thrace stirred. In the south, the Greek city-states whispered of rebellion. To the east, Persia watched, uncertain whether the young Macedonian would hold power or lose it to intrigue. Even within his own court, there were those who waited silently for him to fail. Alexander moved quickly. He understood, as his father had taught him, that hesitation invites rebellion. Within days of Philip's funeral, he rode out with his cavalry, not to grieve but to act. He crossed rivers swollen with spring rain, marched through narrow valleys where mountain winds howled through the rocks, and brought the restless tribes to heel one by one. The campaign was not grand, but it was deliberate. Villages that resisted were subdued, cities that submitted were left in peace. Wherever he went, he treated his enemies not with cruelty but with certainty, a kind of measured firmness that left no room for doubt. In battle, he rode at the front, his helmet glinting in the sun, his voice calm amid the noise. Men followed him not out of fear, but because he never asked of them anything he would not do himself. When he returned to Pella, the kingdom was quiet. Word of his victories spread quickly. The same generals who had served his father now began to speak of the son with respect. "He commands like Philip," one said, "but he moves like something more, yet the greatest test waited to the south." Greece, always proud, always divided, had never loved Macedon. Philip had united it by force, a fragile unity held together by treaties and garrisons. When news of his death reached Athens and Thebes, both cities rejoiced. They believed Macedon would collapse, that the young king would be swept aside like dust in a summer wind. The orator Demosthenes, who had spent years warning Athens of Macedonian tyranny, urged the people to rise again for their freedom. Armies were raised, messengers sent across the Aegean. The old dream of Greek independence, bright and brittle, flickered back to life. Alexander heard the news while inspecting the northern frontiers. He said nothing for a moment, then ordered his army south. They marched without delay, without hesitation, the young king at their head. The columns moved swiftly, so swiftly that, within 2 weeks, the plains of Thessaly lay behind them and the passes of Thermopylae ahead. The Greek cities had expected months of preparation, time to rally their allies and fortify their defenses. Instead, they awoke one morning to see the banners of Macedon already at their gates. At Thebes, the rebellion had gone furthest. Thebes was an old city, proud and fierce, the home of heroes and poets. When Alexander's army appeared before its walls, the people refused to surrender. They believed the other Greek cities would come to their aid. They believed he would hesitate, that youth would bring mercy. But mercy to Alexander was not hesitation. The siege was short and brutal. The walls fell after a day of fighting and Thebes was taken. The city was destroyed, its houses leveled, its people scattered or enslaved. Only the temples and the home of the poet Pindar were spared, at Alexander's command. He ordered this not from cruelty but from calculation. Thebes had been made an example, not a ruin of vengeance, but a warning of order. When the smoke rose from its ashes, Greece fell silent. Athens surrendered without a fight. The other city-states, trembling, sent envoys bearing gifts and apologies. They called him not tyrant, but hegemon, leader of the Greeks. He did not gloat. He accepted their surrender with composure, restored their self-governance, and demanded only one thing in return: unity. The dream that had been his father's now became his own. A league of Greek states, united not against one another but against Persia, the ancient empire across the sea. In the great hall at Corinth, the leaders of Greece gathered. They looked upon the young Macedonian, not yet 21, and saw in him something strange and undeniable, youth clothed in inevitability. He stood before them, tall and calm, and spoke not of conquest, but of destiny. "The time has come," he said softly, "for Greece to rise as one. Our fathers fought Persia in defense. We shall go now in pursuit, not for plunder, but for greatness." Some doubted him, others wept. For the first time in memory, Greece was united. At night, as the campfires burned along the hillsides, Alexander walked alone. The air was cool, the stars bright above the sea. He carried no torch. He had no need of one. His thoughts moved quietly through the dark, of Aristotle's lessons, of Achilles and the long shadow of Troy, of his father's dream now alive in his hands. The empire he would build still lay ahead, vast and distant as the horizon. But already, in the stillness of that night, it had begun. The wind that moved across the plains carried with it the faint scent of salt and cedar, the smell of distant shores waiting to be reached. And somewhere beyond those shores, across the shining waters of the Aegean, the Persian Empire slept, unaware that its long peace was about to end, and that a young king from Macedon had already begun to move the world toward him. By the spring of 334 BC, the world that Alexander had inherited was quiet behind him, and the one he had dreamed of lay ahead, a world of deserts and rivers, of golden cities and legends that shimmered just beyond the edge of the known map. The Aegean Sea lay between them, narrow, glittering, a strip of blue that separated Europe from Asia. To cross it was to cross from the familiar into the vast, and that was exactly what he intended to do. The preparations had taken months. In the harbors of Macedon, ships had been built and gathered, triremes with long, lean hulls, sails patched with sunlight. Soldiers filled the docks, veterans of his father's wars, young men from the farms and towns of Greece, mercenaries drawn by coin or curiosity. There were horses, wagons, blacksmiths, cooks, priests, and scribes. The air smelled of oil, salt, and excitement, the mixture of war and discovery that always comes before the first step into the unknown. Alexander moved among them quietly, checking the lists, inspecting the ships. He had no need to raise his voice. His presence carried farther than command. The men watched him as he walked, a figure neither distant nor entirely human to them, calm in a way that suggested certainty. He spoke to the captains about wind and tide, to the soldiers about courage, to the priests about the favor of the gods. Yet beneath his composure there was a flicker of something else, the stillness before motion, the kind that gathers itself before it breaks into history. At dawn, when the ships were ready, the trumpets sounded softly across the harbor. The sea was smooth and pale under the rising sun. Alexander stepped aboard his flagship and stood at the bow, the wind moving gently through his hair. Behind him, the soldiers filled the decks, their armor catching the light. The oars dipped in unison, the sails unfurled, and the fleet began to move, first slowly, then with the rhythm of inevitability. As the coast of Greece faded behind them, the men grew quiet. The water around them was calm, the sky clear, and for a moment the world seemed to hold only the sound of the sea and the creak of timbers. Alexander watched the horizon without blinking. For years, he had studied the stories of those who had crossed before, the heroes of myth, the merchants, the explorers. Now he was among them. When the faint outline of Asia appeared ahead, his heart stirred not with fear, but with recognition. They landed near a place called Abydos, on the shore of Asia Minor. The beach was long and empty, the sand pale beneath the morning light. When Alexander stepped ashore, he knelt, scooped up a handful of the earth and held it to his lips. "We are in Asia," he said simply. Around him, his officers stood silent, as though they felt the weight of what those words meant. Not far from the shore stood the ruins of ancient Troy, the city of Homer's epics, the city where Achilles had fought and died. Alexander rode there that same day, accompanied by his closest companions. The wind moved softly through the tall grass that now covered the fields where armies had once clashed. The stones of the old walls still stood in places, worn smooth by time. At the tomb said to be that of Achilles, Alexander dismounted and stood alone. The others kept back, watching. He reached down and laid a wreath upon the grave. "Bless me, Achilles," he whispered, as a brother in glory. He had been raised on these stories, the heroes who had crossed this same sea, who had sought honor and immortality in the far lands of Asia. Now, standing where they had stood, he felt not arrogance, but a strange kinship. He had begun to follow not only his father's dream, but the dream of every age before him, to move beyond what was known, to see what waited at the edge of maps. From Troy, he rode inland toward the city of Sardis, through fields blooming with spring. The Persian satraps, governors of this land, had heard of his arrival and gathered their forces. Darius, the great king of Persia, was far away, but his generals were ready to meet the intruder who had dared to step upon their soil. The first great clash came at the river Granicus, a narrow stream, its waters shallow but swift, its banks high with reeds. The Persians waited on the far side, their cavalry gleaming in the sun. The Macedonian army halted on the opposite bank, the men uneasy at the sight of the river's current, and the wall of lances waiting beyond. Alexander rode forward, Bucephalus beneath him, the horse's breath steady and visible in the cool air. He studied the line, the glitter of armor, the angles of light. His generals urged caution, to wait until morning to cross at a safer place. He listened, nodded once, then smiled. "The time for caution," he said, "was before we crossed the sea." He drew his sword, raised it high, and spurred his horse into the water. The soldiers watched him go, a single figure moving against the current, and then, as if pulled by an invisible thread, they followed. The river broke around them in white foam, arrows hissed through the air, horses stumbled and rose again. The noise was immense, shouting, clashing steel, the rush of the stream, yet through it all Alexander's voice could be heard, calm and clear, directing, encouraging. By midday, the Persian line broke. Their cavalry fled, their infantry scattered. The Macedonians climbed the far bank, soaked and triumphant. The first victory of the campaign had been won, not the largest battle he would fight, but the first proof that the dream could be real. Afterward, he walked among the wounded, speaking to each man, remembering names, promising rewards. He gave thanks to the gods, not with grandeur, but with quiet gratitude. "The sea is behind us," he told his officers that night. There is no need to look back. In the days that followed, more cities fell to him, Sardis, Ephesus, Miletus. And some surrendered without resistance, others fought and were taken. Alexander did not linger in any of them. He moved steadily, always eastward, always forward. Each victory was not an ending but a step. At night, he would stand outside his tent, looking toward the horizon. The air in Asia was different, warmer, filled with scents he did not yet know. The stars seemed larger here, closer. He thought of Aristotle's lessons, of how every element seeks its natural place, and he wondered if perhaps his own element was not a place at all, but movement itself. The men grew to sense this in him, that their leader was not driven by greed or restlessness, but by something quieter, deeper. To march with him was to feel that one was walking through the fabric of a story that would never end. And so the army moved on, across rivers and plains, through cities whose languages they did not speak, under skies that seemed to change color with every mile. The drums beat softly, the wheels of the wagons creaked, and at the head of it all rode the young king of Macedon, whose eyes were fixed not on the ground before him, but on the endless, beckoning distance beyond. The land of Persia stretched before Alexander like an ocean, vast, shimmering, and without end. To conquer it was to chase the horizon itself. Yet as he moved deeper into its heart, he did not rush. He advanced as though walking through the corridors of time, step by step, each victory not loud but certain, each new city a reflection of his growing shadow. The battle at the river Granicus had opened the way into Asia Minor, but it was only the beginning. Ahead lay the great cities of the Persian satraps, governors who ruled on behalf of Darius, the king of kings. Their armies were strong, their walls high, their treasuries full. And yet, one by one they would yield to him. At Sardis, the Persian governor came out to meet him, bringing the keys of the citadel. "Great king," he said, bowing low, "the son of Zeus needs no siege." Alexander accepted the surrender with a faint nod. He did not plunder the city. Instead, he restored its ancient temples and confirmed its laws. It was his way, not to destroy but to absorb. Conquest for him was not the ruin of one world but the quiet joining of two. From Sardis, he turned south toward the coast, where the Greek cities of Ionia had long lived under Persian rule. The people there greeted him as a liberator. And temples were opened, statues of the old gods cleaned and adorned, and the tricolour banners of Macedon and Greece fluttered together in the sea wind. He spoke little, but his presence carried assurance, the promise that the age of submission had ended. Still, not all cities yielded so easily. At Halicarnassus, a great port on the Aegean, the Persian governor Memnon resisted fiercely. The walls were strong, the garrison large, and the city held out through long weeks of siege. The sound of catapults echoed through the warm night air, towers burned and collapsed, the sea glowed red with reflection. Yet even here, amid the fire and smoke, Alexander's patience never broke. He directed every movement calmly, like a man rearranging pieces on a board. When the city finally fell, he spared those who surrendered and rebuilt what the fire had consumed. By the year's end, all of Asia Minor lay open before him. He spent the winter in the highlands of Phrygia, where the air was thin and cold. In the old city of Gordium, he came upon a wagon tied with a knot so intricate that no one had ever untangled it. The legend said that whoever could undo the Gordian knot would become ruler of Asia. Alexander studied it for a long moment, then drew his sword and cut through it with a single stroke. "It is done," he said softly. Whether he meant it as jest or prophecy, none could tell, but the story spread like fire through the camps. To some, it was an omen. To others, a symbol that the young king did not wait for destiny to favor him, but shaped it with his own hand. Spring came, and with it the next great movement. His army marched eastward, through valleys filled with wildflowers, through cities whose names would one day vanish from maps. Each day the sun rose behind them and set ahead, and with each setting, they drew closer to the heart of Persia. At Issus, near the shores of the Mediterranean, they met Darius himself for the first time. The Persian army was immense, rows upon rows of soldiers, chariots with blades on their wheels, banners rippling in the wind. The plain between the mountains and the sea was narrow, hemmed in by cliffs and water. It should have favored the Persians, but Alexander saw otherwise. He formed his men into a long line, each section moving like part of a single body. The phalanx advanced, shields glinting, spears low. On the right, Alexander led the cavalry in person, Bucephalus charging through the smoke. The battle was chaos, the crash of steel, the screams of horses, the drum of hooves on damp ground. And then, as he had done so many times, Alexander saw the opening no one else could see. He drove straight for Darius's chariot. The great king, startled, turned and fled. The Persian army broke around him, the line collapsing into confusion. When it was over, the field was littered with the emblems of kingship, the royal tent, the scepter, the cloak. Among the captives were Darius's wife and children. Alexander treated them with courtesy and compassion. He had no wish to shame the royal family, only to replace it. To the queen who trembled before him, he said, "Do not fear, you shall be honored as if Darius still ruled." And so it was. His mercy was not weakness, but design. Each gesture was part of the empire he was building, an empire of both sword and mind. From Issus, he turned south, toward the great city of Tyre, a city built on an island surrounded by the sea. The Tyrians refused him entry, trusting their walls and ships to protect them. But Alexander would not pass it by. He ordered a causeway built from the mainland to the island, stone by stone, an impossible task carried out through patience and will. The siege lasted 7 months. The sea winds howled, the sun burned, the defenders fought with desperate courage. But in the end, the causeway reached the walls, and the city fell. It was the hardest victory he had yet won, and the one that announced to the world that there were no places beyond his reach. From there he moved to Egypt. The people welcomed him gladly. They had suffered under Persian rule and saw in him not a conqueror, but a deliverer. He went to the great temple of Amun at Siwa, deep in the desert, where the priests greeted him as the son of Zeus Ammon. Whether he believed their words or not, he accepted them with calm composure. The desert sun blazed around him, the sand stretching endless and white. In that emptiness, he found stillness, a kind of peace that came not from rest, but from recognition. Before leaving Egypt, he founded a city, Alexandria, on the coast where the Nile meets the sea. He traced its boundaries himself in the sand, speaking softly of harbors and streets, of libraries and markets that would one day rise from this quiet shore. "This," he said, "shall be the bridge between worlds." It was perhaps the truest act of his reign, not the taking of a city, but the creating of one. Alexandria would outlast him, outlast even his empire, standing as a memory of order born from the movement of a single mind. From Egypt, he turned once more eastward, back toward Darius, who had gathered another army, larger still, stretching for miles across the plains of Mesopotamia. The world seemed to narrow toward a single point, a single confrontation. The King of Kings awaited him at Gaugamela, beneath the open sky. And there, amid the dust and the wind, the fate of Persia would be decided. But that is another night's story, a story of stillness before thunder, of clarity amid chaos, and of how one man, calm amid the storm, stood at the very center of history's turning. After years of marching, of dust and battle, of rivers crossed and cities taken, Alexander came at last to a place where the land met the sea in a long, pale curve of sand. The Nile flowed not far away, quiet and unhurried, its waters wide and calm as though weary from their long journey through the desert. The air smelled of salt and sun-warmed stone. Seabirds circled lazily overhead, their cries soft and distant. Here, on this stretch of coast between river and sea, he decided to build something new. It was not born of necessity or strategy. There was no fortress here, no enemy, no threat. The decision came not from war, but from vision. "Here," he said, pointing to the line of the horizon, "we shall build a city that faces both worlds, east and west, a bridge between the lands I have conquered and those yet to come." His officers, accustomed to orders of battle and logistics, looked at him with quiet uncertainty. The place was empty, no buildings, no harbor, only wind and sand. Yet Alexander spoke as though he could already see it. The walls, the temples, the great streets filled with the sound of languages from every corner of his growing empire. The engineers began to work at once, marking the ground with flour where the streets would run, measuring with cords and stakes. The sun rose high and white, the sea glittered like a mirror, and Alexander himself walked the length of the shore, tracing the city's outline in the sand with his staff. He paused often, not to rest but to think, to adjust a line, to widen a road, to make space for something yet unseen. When the first plans were laid out before him, he studied them silently. "This city," he said at last, "shall bear my name." And so on that quiet shore, Alexandria was born. The work began immediately. Foundations were laid, wells dug, stones brought from quarries far inland. Every morning, the air filled with the rhythm of chisels, the soft hum of voices, the slow creak of wooden cranes. Ships anchored offshore, bringing supplies from the islands and from Greece itself. The city seemed to rise not in years, but in moments, as if the land had been waiting for it all along. Alexander visited the site often, speaking with the builders and architects, asking about the direction of the winds, the quality of the soil, the tides of the sea. He ordered a great breakwater to be built, a long arm of stone reaching out into the water, sheltering the harbour that would one day hold ships from every nation. "The sea," he said softly, "is not an obstacle but a road." He imagined ships from India and Africa, from the islands of the Aegean, from the distant western shores of Spain, all docking here, exchanging not only goods, but knowledge. "This city," he told his scholars, "shall be the mind of the empire." And so it became, even before it was finished, a symbol not of conquest, but of connection. A city born not of war, but of curiosity, a place where the world might meet itself. In the evenings, when the labor ceased and the workers sat by their fires, Alexander would walk along the edge of the water. The waves came and went, whispering softly against the sand. He would watch the sun set behind the dunes, the sky turning from gold to rose to deep violet. The horizon seemed infinite. To others it marked the end of sight. To him it was the beginning of thought. He spoke sometimes to his companions of the future. "When we are gone," he said, "this city will remain. Our empires will fade, our battles will be forgotten, but this place will still stand, a place of learning, of exchange, where the memory of what we were will not vanish." He ordered that a great library be built, not immediately, but one day when peace allowed it. "Gather every book, every record," he said, "from every land. The truth of the world is not owned by one people, and it must not be lost." The idea of that library, that vast, quiet hall filled with light and knowledge, became for him a kind of dream. His soldiers spoke of glory, his generals of conquest, but Alexander began to speak more often of understanding. He believed that to know the world was to rule it truly, not with the sword, but with the mind. In the desert beyond the city, the great pyramids rose like mountains of stone, older than memory. Alexander rode there once, in silence, and looked up at their sides. "These were made by men," he said quietly. "And so will what we build be remembered, if we build it not only for power, but for purpose." When he left Egypt, he rode away slowly, turning back once to look at the coastline. The city was still half-built, scaffolds rising, streets not yet paved, but already it seemed alive. The gulls wheeled above it, and the sunlight lay soft upon the sand. He did not know that the city would one day become what he had imagined, a harbour of light in an age of darkness, a place where poets, philosophers, and astronomers would come to learn and teach. He did not know that it would stand for centuries, long after his empire had crumbled, long after his name had become legend. But perhaps, standing there with the wind in his hair and the smell of salt in the air, he sensed it, that rare and gentle truth that what we create outlasts what we conquer. And so he left Alexandria behind him, not as a soldier leaves a camp, but as a father leaves a child, trusting that it will grow beyond him. Ahead lay deserts, rivers, and the high plains of Persia where Darius still gathered his armies and where destiny waited patiently. The city behind him shimmered in the light, its foundations strong, its promise already whispered by the sea. The empire would continue to expand. There would be more victories, more marches, more miles. But Alexandria, quiet, enduring, eternal, would remain his most peaceful triumph. When Alexander left Egypt, the sun was high and the air carried the scent of the sea behind him. Ahead lay the open road, a road that would stretch for years, winding across deserts, rivers, and mountains. The empire was already vast, but his gaze did not rest upon what he had won. It lingered instead on what remained unseen, the lands that waited beyond the maps, the stories that no Greek had yet heard. He marched north again, through Syria, through the plains where the air shimmered with heat, through valleys that smelled of dust and dry grass. Along the way, envoys came from every direction, from Phoenicia, from Mesopotamia, from cities that had once bowed to Darius. They came bearing tribute, gifts, and words of surrender. But for Alexander, these gestures were not enough. He sought not submission, but comprehension. He wanted to see with his own eyes what he ruled, to stand upon every stone of the world he was shaping. The army moved like a tide, slow and deliberate. Columns of men stretched for miles, soldiers, horses, wagons, herds of animals, and the long trains of servants and craftsmen who followed an army that was no longer only an army, but a moving city. Each morning they rose before dawn. The air was cool then, the stars still visible. The soldiers packed their gear in silence, the sound of hooves and harnesses blending with the low murmur of voices. When the first light touched the horizon, the order to march would come, and the line would move forward once again, always eastward. In the villages they passed, the people would watch from a distance, uncertain whether this endless column of men was a storm or a season. Some bowed, some fled, and some simply stood still, their faces unreadable. Alexander would ride at the front, Bucephalus beneath him, his cloak brushing the wind. He greeted the elders, accepted offerings of bread and fruit, and left behind gifts of silver and assurance. It was said that he slept little, spoke little, and listened much. As the months turned, the land began to change. The lush plains of Mesopotamia gave way to the dry plateaus of Persia. The rivers grew fewer, the days hotter. Dust clung to the soldiers' armor, their faces grew lean and burned by the sun. Yet they did not complain. They had seen too much, followed too far. Their loyalty was no longer a matter of command, it was habit, something woven into their days like the rhythm of breath. They reached the heart of Persia, to the ancient city of Persepolis, the jewel of Darius's empire, built on terraces that caught the morning light like gold. The gates were carved with lions and bulls, the columns rose as high as trees. Here, for the first time, Alexander hesitated. This was not merely another city to be taken. It was the heart of a civilization, old, proud, and immense. When the city fell, its treasures astonished even the soldiers. Gold, silver, ivory, and jewels filled its halls, gathered through centuries of rule. The men, wild with triumph, wished to plunder it, to burn it to the ground as a symbol of victory. For days, Alexander resisted them. He walked through the palace in silence, tracing his fingers along the carved walls. The stories of kings before him were etched there, stories of peace and rule, of order and the patience of time. But one night, during a feast, the wine flowed too freely. Someone, perhaps a companion, perhaps the wind itself, whispered that this was vengeance for Greece, for the burning of Athens long ago. Torches were raised, laughter turned to shouting, and flames spread through the halls. By morning, Persepolis was a ruin. The air was thick with smoke, the stone walls blackened. Alexander rode through the ashes slowly, his face unreadable. Later, he would regret it. The destruction, the loss of beauty that could never be rebuilt. It was not victory, he said softly, but weakness that lit those fires. From Persepolis he marched on toward the eastern provinces, through lands that had never seen armies like his. The terrain grew harsher. Mountains rose from the earth, like the spines of sleeping beasts. The passes were narrow and cold, the air thin. Snow appeared on the peaks, even as the valleys burned with heat. Each day was a test. Food grew scarce, roads vanished into stone. The soldiers began to wonder where the edge of the world might lie, and whether their king even sought it, or simply the act of seeking. Yet they followed. They had come too far to turn back. At night, when the fires burned low and the camp was quiet, Alexander would sit apart from his generals, looking out over the darkness. Sometimes he spoke to no one, sometimes to the stars. "When a man stops moving," he said once, "he begins to die." His words drifted into the wind, carried off into the emptiness. He began to adopt the dress of Persian nobles, to learn their customs and ceremonies. To some of his men this seemed strange, even dangerous, as though their king were becoming too much like the people they had conquered. But Alexander saw it differently. He wished to unite the world, not divide it. "If we are to rule them," he said, "we must understand them." He held banquets where Greeks and Persians dined side by side, where translators whispered between them. He married a Persian princess, Roxana, not as a gesture of alliance but as a bridge, one heart joining two worlds. His soldiers grumbled, but they saw in his calm a conviction they could not shake. The march went on. The rivers became smaller, the nights colder, the faces in the villages more unfamiliar. The empire grew like a shadow stretching eastward, but within that shadow, fatigue began to grow. Even the officers who had once ridden at his side with joy now spoke of rest. "We have crossed the world," one of them said. "Let it be enough." Alexander listened, but he did not agree. "The world," he replied softly, "does not end where we grow tired." And so they continued, through mountain storms, through valleys carved by rivers older than memory, through silence so vast it seemed the sky itself was watching. The soldiers began to move in rhythm with the earth, step by step, heartbeat by heartbeat, until time lost its meaning. In the distance, beyond the next range of hills, the land began to green again. There were strange trees there, wide rivers, and new languages spoken in soft, lilting tones. India awaited, a place where elephants roamed the forests and the air smelled of rain. But for now, as the army camped beneath the mountains, the fires burned low and the men slept where they fell, Alexander stood awake, watching the moonlight fall across the peaks. The sound of wind in the rocks was the only voice that spoke. He thought of home, of the Aegean Sea and the hills of Macedon. They felt distant now, like dreams remembered through fog. Yet even then, even in that stillness, he did not long to return. Because for him, the journey itself, the endless march into the east, had become home. The plains of Gaugamela were vast and bare, stretching beneath the open sky like a sea of dust and silence. The air was dry and sharp, the earth pale and smooth beneath the feet of thousands of men. There, between two rivers in northern Mesopotamia, the long road of conquest reached its greatest turning point. On one side stood Alexander and his army, smaller in number, seasoned and silent. On the other stood Darius, the king of kings, surrounded by an ocean of soldiers and banners that rippled like waves in the wind. For days, the armies watched each other from a distance. The Persian camp spread wide, its fires shining at night like a city of stars across the plain. The Macedonians camped more tightly, their tents orderly and plain, their fires few. Between them lay emptiness, a waiting space where history itself seemed to hold its breath. And Darius had chosen the ground himself. He had it cleared and levelled, the stones removed, the earth smoothed, so his chariots armed with scythes could move without obstruction. He had gathered men from every corner of his empire, Persians, Medes, Bactrians, Indians, Scythians from the north. It was said there were more than 250,000 in his ranks. Against them, Alexander had scarcely 40,000. Yet he did not look afraid. The night before the battle was calm. The sky was clear, the stars bright. In the Persian camp, the noise of preparation filled the air, armor polished, horses fed, orders shouted. In the Macedonian camp, it was quiet. Alexander walked among his men, speaking softly, stopping to share bread and water with them. "Tomorrow," he said, "we fight not for survival, but for what we have already built." His generals waited with him in his tent. They discussed formations, the position of the phalanx, the timing of the cavalry charge. He listened, nodded, and at last said, "The gods have already written the outcome. We must only play our part with grace." He slept that night as he always did before battle, deeply, without fear. The others did not. When dawn came, the soldiers found him still resting, calm as if in a dream. It was said that Parmenion, his old general, entered the tent and woke him, whispering that Darius and his vast army were already drawn up in the field. Alexander opened his eyes, stretched slightly, and smiled. "Then he has saved me the trouble of finding him." The sun rose red and slow over the eastern hills. The light fell across the plain, touching the tips of spears, the edges of shields, the manes of restless horses. Dust hung in the air like mist. The Persians stood in lines that seemed to reach the horizon. And Darius's chariot gleamed in the center, its wheels capped with gold. He wore a robe of purple and white, and the great crown of Persia shone above his brow. Across from him, Alexander mounted Bucephalus, his old companion, scarred from years of battle, still strong. He wore no crown, no purple cloak, only his familiar armor and the calm of command. He rode to the front of his line, turned, and looked down its length. His soldiers watched him in silence. He lifted his hand and pointed forward. "Remember this day," he said. "Not for what we shall take, but for what we shall prove, that courage weighs more than numbers." The trumpet sounded, low and steady. The battle began. At first, it was movement without chaos, formations gliding forward, the slow grind of wheels, the shimmer of heat rising from the ground. The Persians advanced like a tide, their front lines stretching wider than the Macedonians could see. Chariots raced ahead, their blades flashing. Alexander waited until they were close, then signaled. The front ranks of his phalanx opened just enough for the chariots to pass through harmlessly, then closed again behind them. The soldiers struck at the horses, the drivers, the wheels, and the chariots fell apart in the dust. Then came the cavalry. On the right, Alexander led his companion cavalry himself, driving forward toward Darius's center. On the right, Alexander led his companion cavalry himself, driving forward toward Darius's center. He moved with precision, never rushing, each decision a note in a song only he could hear. He feinted to the right, drawing the Persian cavalry with him, and then, in a single, sudden motion, wheeled left and charged through the gap that opened before him. The Persians, vast but slow to react, faltered. In the chaos that followed, Alexander rode straight for Darius. The two kings saw each other across the field, one surrounded by splendor, the other by dust. For a moment, their eyes met. And Darius turned his chariot and fled. His army saw him go, and their courage fled with him. The battle dissolved. What had begun as order became confusion, then collapse. The Persian line folded upon itself, soldiers breaking ranks, throwing down weapons, running in every direction. The Macedonians pressed forward, but Alexander called them to stop the pursuit. He looked out across the plain, his face expressionless. The victory was total, but his voice, when he spoke, was quiet. The empire is ours. See that it does not burn beneath our feet. That night the field was silent again. The fires of the Persian camp burned low. The cries of the wounded drifted like wind through the dark. Alexander stood alone for a long while, his cloak drawn tight against the chill. He had won what his father had dreamed of. More than that, he had won what no man before him had ever dared. The Persian Empire, the greatest the world had known, had fallen in a single day. And yet, as he looked at the stars, he felt no triumph, only stillness. The map of the world, once so full of borders, now stretched empty before him. There was nowhere left to march that he could name, yet the pull of distance did not fade. He ordered that Darius be pursued, not in hatred but in duty. "The war is not done," he said softly. "It is only changing its shape." When the messenger came days later, bringing word that Darius had been found, betrayed and dying, left by his own men, Alexander rode to him at once. He knelt beside the fallen king, removed his helmet, and bowed his head. "You were greater in defeat than many in victory," he said. He covered Darius with his own cloak and ordered that he be buried with honor. After Gaugamela, the cities of Persia opened their gates without resistance. Babylon, Susa, and Ecbatana welcomed him, not as a conqueror but as a ruler returned. The treasures of centuries lay before him, yet he took little for himself. He walked through the gardens, the halls lined with blue tiles and gold, and said, "These things are beautiful. Let them remain as they are." And then, with the calm of one who knows there is always one more horizon, he turned east once more. The empire lay behind him, wide and complete, but his journey was not over. "There is always another world," he told his generals, "for those who refuse to stop walking." The stars above Mesopotamia burned white and clear. The wind moved softly across the plain, carrying away the last scent of battle. The earth, which had trembled beneath the hooves of armies, was quiet again. In that quiet, history exhaled. After Gaugamela, after Babylon and Susa and Persepolis, after the crowns of kings had been set aside and the treasures of empires had been counted, Alexander still did not stop. The map had changed, and the world beneath his feet had widened, but the horizon always stayed just ahead, a soft line of promise he could never quite reach. From the plains of Persia, he turned east again, toward lands that even the Persians had never fully claimed, the lands beyond the mountains, where the sun rose from the edges of the earth. The air there was different, thin, clean, and faintly sweet, scented with dust and pine. The men who followed him had already walked farther than any army in memory. Their sandals were worn thin, their armor had dulled from sun and wind. Yet they followed still, bound not by orders, but by something quieter, the rhythm of motion, the habit of moving toward the unknown. They crossed deserts where the wind moved like smoke, where no birds sang and no water flowed. The sand whispered beneath their feet, the sun shone white and unyielding. At night, the sky filled with stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, and in that light, the weary soldiers spoke softly to one another, of home, of family, of the sea they had not seen in years. Sometimes, Alexander rode ahead alone, the sound of Bucephalus's hooves the only noise in the great silence. He had grown leaner, harder, but not colder. He had begun to speak less, to look farther. The dream that had begun as conquest had become something else, a search, perhaps, for a place where motion could end without surrender. They passed through mountain passes, so narrow that the sunlight reached the ground for only an hour each day. The air was sharp there, thin and cold, smelling of stone. The peaks rose on either side, like the walls of a cathedral built by the earth itself. In the villages along the way, people stared in wonder at the army that seemed to have come from another world. Their languages were strange, their customs unfamiliar, but Alexander greeted them all with the same calm courtesy. He accepted their gifts, returned their gestures of peace, and moved on. In Bactria, he paused for a time. The land was green and fertile, crossed by clear rivers and dotted with orchards. Here he met Roxana, the daughter of a local nobleman. She was quiet, intelligent, and beautiful, with eyes that seemed to see both strength and weariness in him. Their marriage was small, without grandeur, but it carried a meaning greater than ceremony. It joined East and West, not by treaty, but by love, or something near enough to it. For a while, the army rested. The men built houses and gardens, married local women, and began to believe, perhaps, that the march had reached its end. But the restlessness that lived in Alexander could not sleep. He spoke of new lands, of the Indus River, of places where elephants roamed and the air shimmered with monsoon rain. "There is still more of the world," he said softly. "We have only begun to see it," and so the march began again. The further east they went, the stranger the land became. The plains gave way to jungles, the jungles to rivers so wide that the far bank could barely be seen. The rains came without warning, sudden and heavy, turning the roads to rivers, the rivers to floods. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and blooming plants. Insects filled the air like mist. The soldiers moved through the water to their knees, their shields slick with rain, their eyes heavy from exhaustion. They fought battles still, not great wars, but brief and fierce encounters in villages and river valleys. At the Hydaspes River, they met an Indian king named Porus, who stood tall upon an elephant, proud and unflinching. The battle was long and terrible, fought in rain and mud. The elephants charged, their tusks adorned with iron, the ground shook beneath them. Alexander, soaked to the bone, led his men across the river in the dark, striking the enemy from the flank at dawn. The fighting lasted all day. When it ended, Porus, wounded but unbowed, was brought before him. "How do you wish to be treated?" Alexander asked. Porus, bleeding but calm, replied, "As a king." Alexander smiled faintly. "You have spoken like one." He restored Porus to his throne and gave him lands besides. It was not conquest now, but recognition, one ruler honoring another. Yet the victory did not bring joy. The soldiers, hardened by years of war, began to murmur of home. The endless roads, the unending rain, the foreign skies, they began to weigh upon them. They missed the dry winds of Macedon, the taste of wine, the sight of familiar stars. When Alexander spoke of marching farther, of the great ocean said to lie beyond India, the men did not cheer. They stood in silence. At last, they came to a river so vast it seemed to flow from the ends of the earth. The rain fell hard that day, drumming softly against the armor of men who would go no further. Alexander rode before them, his cloak clinging to his shoulders, his face unreadable. He looked out across the water, endless and brown, and then turned back to his army. They said nothing. They did not need to. He dismounted, stood still for a long moment, and then nodded. "We will return," he said quietly. No anger, no disappointment, only acceptance. For the first time, the march had reached its edge, not in defeat, but in stillness. The return journey was long and bitter. The monsoon rains gave way to sun, to heat so fierce that the desert itself seemed to shimmer. The men marched through wastelands where water vanished from their skins before they could sweat, where the air was dry as ash. And many died, and some fell behind and were buried by the wind. Alexander pressed on, as if to prove that endurance itself was a kind of victory. When they reached the coast at last, the sea lay before them, blue and vast and calm. He stood at its edge, the salt wind on his face, and for a moment he was silent. Then he smiled faintly. "At last," he said, "I have seen the end of the world. It is not the end, but the beginning." They built ships and sailed along the shore, following the coastline westward. The sea was peaceful, the waves rhythmic and low. The men rested, watching the water move like silk beneath them. The worst was behind them now, but something inside their king had begun to fade. He no longer rode ahead as eagerly as before. His words grew fewer, his gaze longer. The horizon that had once called to him now seemed, at times, to look back in silence. When they returned to Babylon, the city glowed beneath the sun, golden walls, hanging gardens, and rivers that wound through the streets like veins of light. The soldiers wept with relief. The march was over. But Alexander, standing on the balcony of his palace, looked east once more. Beyond the desert, beyond the mountains, beyond the rivers, the world still stretched on. He had followed it as far as a man could walk. Perhaps, he thought, that was enough. He turned from the window, his reflection dimming in the fading light, and for the first time in his life, he did not plan another journey. The march back to Babylon was long and heavy, as though the very air of the world had grown tired. The soldiers walked in silence now, their faces lean, their armor dulled, their eyes distant. The songs that had once filled the night air had faded. They no longer spoke of new horizons, only of home, the smell of vineyards, the cool shade of olive trees, the sound of waves on familiar shores. Alexander rode among them as he always had, but something in him had changed. The restlessness that had carried him across continents had quieted, though not from peace. It was the silence of a man who has reached the farthest point of his journey and found no edge, only the endless curve of the earth. Babylon welcomed him as a god. The gates of the city, carved with lions and glazed in blue, opened wide. Crowds filled the streets, their voices rising like waves. Flowers fell from balconies, incense burned in the temples. Musicians played soft flutes, and the air smelled of myrrh and honey. He accepted their praise with a faint, tired smile. He walked among them, but his thoughts were elsewhere, not on triumph but on time. The world he had conquered seemed smaller now, as though the vastness of it had folded inward. The months that followed were filled with plans. New maps were drawn, new expeditions imagined. He spoke of sailing down the Arabian coast, of exploring the great seas that lay beyond. Yet those who knew him best saw that his energy was dimming. He still spoke with precision, still moved with grace, but there were moments when his gaze drifted far beyond the room, as though listening to a sound that no one else could hear. In the great palace at Babylon, he held councils each day. Ambassadors came from every direction, from Greece, from Persia, from India, each seeking his favor, his decision, his acknowledgement. He received them all with patience, but afterward, when the rooms were empty, he would walk alone in the gardens. The gardens were a wonder, terraces of green rising above the city, watered by channels drawn from the river. At dusk, the air was cool and fragrant. He would sit beside the fountains and watch the water fall in thin, shimmering threads. Sometimes he spoke softly to himself, recalling names long forgotten, places left behind. He was 32 years old. The empire stretched from the mountains of Macedon to the edges of India. There was nothing left to conquer, yet he could not rest. Motion had become his nature, and stillness, though peaceful, carried a kind of ache. In those quiet walks, the memories began to return. The sound of the Hellespont, the first crossing into Asia, the dust of Gaugamela, the rain over the Hydaspes. The faces of men who had followed him, who had died, believing they were building something eternal. He remembered their laughter, their songs around the fires, their faith. It all felt near and distant at once, like the echo of waves in a seashell. He began to drink more, perhaps to dull the thoughts that came when the nights grew too still. His companions noticed, but none dared to speak. They feared not his anger, but the sorrow that seemed to live behind his eyes. Even Bucephalus was gone now, the old horse buried in the east, beneath a mound that bore his name. The loss of that companion seemed to weigh upon him more than any crown or throne. In the spring of that final year, a festival was held in Babylon. The air was warm, the river full, the city alive with music. Alexander joined his officers in a banquet, his mood brighter than it had been in months. They spoke of old victories, of battles retold like legends. Someone poured more wine. The night grew long. When at last he rose to leave, he coughed softly and pressed his hand to his side. The gesture was small, unnoticed. But the next morning he could not rise. At first he thought it was exhaustion. He had known weariness before, the deep kind that seeps into bone and breath. But this was different. His head burned with fever, his limbs grew heavy. The physicians came, bringing herbs and prayers. The air in his chamber filled with the scent of cedar smoke and whispered hope. Outside, the city continued as always, merchants calling in the markets, children laughing in the courtyards, the river gliding quietly beneath its bridges. But inside the palace, time slowed. His generals came one by one, standing beside his bed in silence. He spoke to them softly, his voice faint but steady. "The work is not finished," he said. "You must hold it together." They asked to whom he left his empire. He smiled faintly, eyes half closed.
"To the strongest," he whispered.
The fever rose. For days, he drifted in and out of sleep, dreaming of rivers, of stars, of the sound of marching feet fading into the distance. Those who sat by him said that sometimes he murmured names, of places, of friends, of gods, and sometimes he smiled as though remembering a moment of sunlight long ago. When at last he could no longer speak, he asked for his soldiers to be brought before him. They came in long lines, silent and weeping. He could not stand, but he lifted his hand weakly to each of them as they passed. Some touched his fingers, others bowed their heads. The room filled with the sound of quiet sobbing. Outside, the sun was setting. The light through the high windows was golden and soft. The air shimmered with heat, with the faint sound of birds calling from the gardens. Alexander's eyes opened once more. He looked toward the light and breathed deeply, as though trying to remember the scent of the sea. And then, without struggle, without word, he was gone. The room was still. The world, for a moment, seemed to stop breathing with him. They said that as the news spread through the city, the people fell silent, not out of fear, but in disbelief that a man who had seemed so unending could end at all. Outside the palace, the evening wind stirred the trees. The river moved quietly past the walls, carrying with it petals from the gardens, small, white, and drifting. The empire would fracture in the years to come, divided among his generals, his visions scattered like dust across the lands he had crossed. But for that single moment, in that quiet room, there was no empire, no war, no ambition, only the soft sound of water, the fading light, and the stillness of one man's long journey finally at rest. When the last breath left Alexander and the lamps in his chamber were lowered, the palace at Babylon grew very quiet. Outside, the river slid past with its patient murmuring, and the evening breeze pressed gently against the curtains as if to remind the living that the world continues, even when a single life, however vast, has come to rest. Men stepped into the corridor and spoke in whispers. Sandals moved along stone floors with the hush of soft rain. And in that stillness, the question that had waited at the edge of every triumph finally took its place in the room. What happens to a dream when its dreamer is gone? The empire stretched like a ribbon of light across the map, from the green hills of Macedon to the dusty edges of India, stitched together by roads, garrisons, oaths, and the steady rhythm of a single will. For years, that will had held everything in balance. Now the balance trembled. The generals, men who had learned to read the world by the tilt of Alexander's head and the angle of his hand upon a map, looked at one another and saw not enemies, not yet, but possibilities, the strange, new openness that follows the end of certainty. They gathered in a wide hall where the air was cooled by water running through channels in the floor. Torches flickered. On the wall hung carpets woven with gardens and stars. The scent of cedar drifted from the beams above. Around them stood the guards of many nations, Macedonians in their short cloaks, Persians with tall caps, Egyptians with gold-studded collars. A quiet reminder that the empire was not one thing, but many, held together by the habit of a single name. There were arguments gently spoken at first, then more firm. Some said the king's unborn child, if a son, should inherit. Others named his half-brother, gentle in nature and unfit for the weight of rule. Still others suggested they rule together in trust, keeping the empire whole until fate chose an heir. Outwardly, they spoke of duty. Inwardly, they counted loyalties like coins in a purse, weighing friendships, rivalries, distances, and the patience of their own ambitions. The compromise that emerged was as fragile as spun glass. 2 kings would be named, the half-brother Philip Aridaeus, and, when born, the infant Alexander IV, kings in title, sheltered by the hands of regents. Administration would be divided. Officers confirmed in the satrapies they already held, others moved to places that might temper their power, command of the army entrusted to one, then another, in the hope that no single man would gather all the threads at once. The empire would be kept intact in words, if not in the quiet truth of things. In the courtyards, pigeons fluttered among the columns. In the kitchens, water boiled, bread baked, meat roasted. In the stables, horses stamped and shook their manes. The palace continued its routines, because that is what great houses do. They carry on, unaware that history is pausing at the threshold. Outside the city, the countryside lay pale with heat. Farmers walked in furrowed fields. Shepherds moved along the canals with flocks that stirred like ripples on a pond. None of them knew the names of the generals in the hall, nor the delicacy of the thread that now held their lives together. They knew only that new messengers would come with new seals on their orders, and that, as always, the seasons would ask for seed and harvest, patience and hope. The first division was not a crack, but a soft drift, like the slow drawing apart of floating ice when the current changes beneath it. Antipater, older than the rest and steady as an old oak, took guardianship of Macedon and Greece, where the cities would need watching and the fields would need defending. Ptolemy, thoughtful and practical, went down to Egypt, where the Nile's breath cools the air and knowledge gathers itself in scrolls. Seleucus, patient and watchful, remained near the heart of Asia, where roads spread like spokes from a wheel. Lysimachus kept Thrace, rugged and green, pressed between the mountains and the sea. Cassander circled near the homeland, measuring power in careful steps. Others took other portions, satrapies along the rivers, provinces of temples and deserts, places where new names were written quietly over old ones. For a time, the arrangement held, the way a delicate balance sometimes holds in the last calm before the wind. Men wrote letters to one another, with respectful greetings and promises that sounded true while ink was still wet. They sealed those letters and sent them along familiar roads, where dust rose behind the hooves of a courier's horse. But distance changes the meaning of agreements, the way light changes as it moves through water. At the edges of the empire, authority became a softer thing, not a voice that commands, but a conversation that must persuade. In the halls of Babylon, the two kings, one gentle and bewildered, the other not yet born, became symbols. Crowns were held over heads, oaths were taken in their names, edicts issued with their seals, and yet decisions were made elsewhere. In the tents of ambitious men, in the private rooms where maps lay spread under oil lamps, in the quiet corners where messengers waited by doors. Even loyalty, which had once flowed like a river toward a single source, now broke into rivulets, running toward those who could pay, protect, or promise. The argument that had been softly deferred returned, as arguments do, with a different face. Who would guard the kings? Who would lead the army? Who would speak for the empire when it required a single voice? Answers were offered, then reconsidered, then withdrawn. The men who had once moved as one under Alexander now moved like stars in a loose constellation, bound by gravity, yet each following a line of motion of its own. The first small wars were like summer storms, brief, loud, and soon forgotten, leaving the air heavy but clear. A skirmish to resolve a dispute over a border town. A siege to settle a grievance of honor. An ambush that answered a letter with a blade. Each man told himself it was not rebellion, only correction, not betrayal, only necessity. The empire, they said, must survive, though if asked quietly in the night, each might admit that what they meant by empire had become a reflection of their own outline. In Egypt, Ptolemy took care to build not only walls but memory. He received Alexander's body with solemn ceremony, allowing the grief of many peoples to gather and flow toward a single, enduring place. He restored temples worn by time. He welcomed scholars who found in the dry air and the calm shade of porticos a perfect climate for thought. As years passed, he began the work that would outlast kingdoms and crowns, a library vast and luminous, where the whispered wisdom of 1,000 journeys would be stored against the accidents of weather and war. And boats full of papyrus and parchment slipped quietly up the Nile. Copyists bent over desks in long, cool rooms, a city of knowledge grew beside a river older than dynasties. In Asia, Seleucus learned the shape of distance, how roads carry both tribute and news, how a satrapy held with patience can be stronger than one seized by force. He planted cities like bright beads along trade routes, where merchants spoke many languages and exchanged not only goods, but customs, recipes, songs. Markets buzzed beneath new colonnades. Coinage carried the familiar profile of kings long dead. The calendar measured both sowing and sacrifice. Between mountains and plains, he profited from the slow art of keeping many worlds in modest harmony. In Macedon and Greece, Antipater and later Cassander kept order with the steady hand that small and jealous cities require. Demosthenes' voice, long silent, was remembered more than heard. The people desired peace, the way tired men desire sleep. And fields needed tending, vineyards pruning, and the spear that once leaned by the door now hung farther back, behind tools of harvest and household. The war that had traveled outward into deserts and jungles seemed to them like a story told by grandfathers at dusk, both true and far away. In Thrace, Lysimachus held rugged country where winter sets its teeth and the sea sends sudden storms against the cliffs. He learned that strength was not a march, but a stance, feet set, shield firm, eyes steady on a horizon that offered more weather than war. So the empire became a collection of empires, the way a constellation is many stars, that a child draws together with lines only the heart can see. The names of the new rulers spread slowly along the old roads, and in villages where no one had ever seen a king, the tax collector's seal changed color, the temple prayers added a new title, the market weighed its measures in coin of fresh mint. In the midst of this settling, there were sharp edges, the places where ambition and caution scrape against each other and spark. And friendships bent under the weight of opportunity. Alliances shifted like dunes in a wind. Men who had once eaten from the same pot now sat in different camps, speaking of prudence in the same measured tone they had used years before to speak of glory. Sometimes they met again, across a riverbank parley beneath an awning in the heat of noon, and looked for a brief and human moment, past arguments to the long road they had walked together behind a boy who became a banner. And always, there were the small people, the ones history sees from a height, the potter moulding clay in a city newly named, the mother bent over a child in a house that smelled of cumin and bread, the soldier with old scars who traded his spear for a plough and learned again the weight of soil in a palm. For them, the division of an empire looked like a new magistrate in the square, a different language added to a market's chatter, a tax that came due on a day now marked by a foreign festival. Time, which had hurried under Alexander like a river in flood, found again its slower course. Children grew into the peace their parents had feared they'd never see. Scholars copied books with neat, unhurried hands. Stonecutters carved laws into tablets and left space for amendments. Priests counted the years by eclipses, merchants by caravans, sailors by stars. The world did not forget the whirlwind. It simply learned to live with the weather that follows it. Stories rose, the way fog rises from a field at dawn. Some said Alexander was a god who had visited the earth, others, a man who had reached beyond a man's reach and paid a man's price. In taverns and under porticos, in barracks and at weddings, men told their sons that once there had been a king who crossed rivers as if they were roads and deserts, as if they were pauses between thoughts. They told of Bucephalus, brave and black, of the chariot of Darius fleeing like a comet's tail, of the city by the sea where knowledge was to be gathered like grain in season. They told it softly with the backward glance of people who know that a story is both a truth and a light. In Babylon, the gardens went on blooming for a while. In Susa, the treasuries filled and emptied as generations of careful hands moved coin and cloth. In Alexandria, New shelves were added to the library, and scholars argued in low voices about the distance to the sun and the cure for fevers. In Bactria, orchards flowered white in spring. In the Punjab, monsoon rains returned on schedule, patient as breath. Across all these places, new rulers placed new seals on old doors and learned that a city is not governed by decree alone, but by the small habits of mornings and markets. As for the kings named in the name of another, the gentle half-brother with eyes clear and lost, the child who would become a shadow on a coin, they were folded, as the fragile often are, into the pages where historians pause and turn to the larger story. Their lives were brief, their ends sorrowful in the way that ends often are when power is a weapon lying on a table within many hands' reach. They were mourned and then spoken of less and less as years smoothed the rough places of memory. The empire did not collapse with a sound, it softened into a continent of echoes. From those echoes grew the Hellenistic kingdoms, Egypt with its soft gold light and patient scribes, Syria and Mesopotamia with their caravan cities, highlands where Greek and local tongues braided into new speech, and musicians tuned lutes to scales neither wholly new nor wholly old. Art changed. Columns rose in a different proportion, and gods learned one another's names. In marketplaces where once a Greek might have felt alone, a generation later he might find familiar cheese and a proverb that sounded like something his grandmother would have said. If Alexander's dream had been of a world made one, what remained was a world that had learned to shake hands. Not unity but conversation. Not peace forever but a longer pause between storms. The legions of later centuries would march across these same roads. Other banners would rise and fall. Yet everywhere they went, they would find his footprints under their feet, a bridge, a language, a habit of measuring the earth with the straight line of a surveyor's cord. Sometimes, in the cool hours before dawn, old soldiers sat beside a door and watched the sky lighten. They remembered the crossing of the Hellespont and the breath that caught in a young man's throat when Asia first appeared like a promise on the horizon. They remembered the rain at the Hydaspes and the way elephants move when the ground is mud. They remembered the night fires reflected in the black eye of a horse whose name was spoken like a prayer. They were not sad. They were not proud. They were something quieter, the way a field is quiet after harvest, stubble standing in low light, earth breathing warm beneath the first thin frost. The empire turned into years, and the years turned into stories, and the stories into a slender thread that children braid into their own ideas of courage. Somewhere, a teacher unrolls a parchment and reads aloud a name that shines like old bronze, Alexandros. Somewhere else, a traveler enters a city whose streets run straight to a harbor and feels, without words, that the place was drawn by a steady hand. Somewhere in a house at the edge of a desert, a woman lights a lamp, and the flame lifts like a small, certain star, and the room is bright enough to read. And so the division of an empire becomes, at last, the gathering of a world into a quieter shape. The kings rule and die, the cities trade and sing, the rivers turn their wheels. The constellations take their familiar places, and the wind moves over barley and over marble with the same gentle sound. If you listen very late, when the streets are empty and the sea breathes in its sleep, you can almost hear the softest echo of marching, not the iron rhythm of conquest, but the human rhythm underneath it, the one that goes on, step, breath, step, long after drums are put away. It is the measure of people making their mornings, of markets opening, of scribes dipping pens in ink, of children learning letters, of ships leaning into a wind that smells faintly of salt and figs. Alexander's empire ended as all empires do, not with the end of the world, but with the world carrying on. What remains is the memory of a young man who would not stop walking, and the knowledge that for a little while, under a wide and patient sky, he stitched together the edges of many peoples so that, later, they might find one another again by following the seams. And now the lamps in Babylon are long since cold, the gardens are stones and sand, the names of satraps have faded into the gentle dust of library shelves. But the city by the sea still listens to the tide, and in its old wind you can hear the whisper of pages turning, a voice that says, softly and without hurry, "We remember."